now I'm going to ask Mei Fong to come up, and she's going to have a brief slideshow, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Mei is a former FCC member, right? She was here in Hong Kong for 3 years. She was in Beijing for 3 years, working for the Wall Street Journal. And obviously that's when she did the research and conceived of the idea for her book. And she's now based in DC and is a fellow of the think tank New America. So welcome, Mei Fong. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor, and thank you all. This is, in a sense, as Victor said, a homecoming for me. I was here at FCC and in Hong Kong for the Wall Street Journal, and hello to some of my external colleagues. Thanks for coming to support. So thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the one-child policy here, and I've been told I have a very short period of time, so a start time of 15 minutes. Now, when China announced the switch to the nationwide two-child policy last year, I was just in the process of sending out media review copies of my book. So I was very fortunate and possibly the only case of a foreign journalist ever receiving public relations help from the Chinese Communist Party. Now, of course, the reason why there was the switch to the nationwide two-child policy is for some of the reasons that I outline in my book. I know a lot of you know quite a bit about it, but I'll run through it very quickly. The one-child policy was conceived and launched about well over 30 years ago in 1980. And over the course of this extremely long period of time, it has created a very unbalanced population, which they are now seeking to address with this new change. And the imbalance primarily revolves around gender. There are 2 male now, with over 30 million surplus males. That's about the size of Canada. They are also getting to be too old. 1 in 3 retirees by 2050. In terms of an actual size, that's more than a population of Europe. So if all the senior citizens in China were to get together and form their own nation, they would be the world's 3rd largest nation. You would have China, India, and senior China. So these are some of the issues, and then of course you also have problems with social problems that are sort of discussed in the book. So for the example, what happens when you have a nation that's significantly made of only children? What does this mean for the future? What happens when you have a nation that's very significantly male? And there've been a lot of discussion. These are things and topics that I talk about in the book. I also talk about how this whole thing was conceived. So broadly speaking, I've raised the outlines, and I'm just going to show you this population pyramid in 1953. Standard, you know, lots of younger people at the bottom, and it peters out at the top as you get to the older ages when people die off. And then we've sort of seen this sort of change from a pyramid shape to see 2000 is more like a prow of a battleship, where you have that bulge in the middle of working class population, which is very good for China's population manufacturing boom. You have a significant cheap labor force, which is just in time to take advantage of the manufacturing issue. But then at the end, this is what you have. You have more like a diamond shape, and this is the fear they have, that increasingly they will have a working age population that is too small to support their retirement community. Now, these are sort of just the broad outlines of this, but if I wanted to just write this book on numbers, I don't think anybody would want to read it. You could probably find all of this if you want it in World Bank reports, United Nations reports. What I wanted to do was write this book for the mass market, tell stories. What this means when you significantly alter the demographics of a country, when almost 1/3 of all households are single-child households. How do you tell this story? And my story begins in 2008 when I was sent to Beijing to cover the Olympics. And I wasn't doing it as a sports story because I don't know much about sports, but I was writing about it as a great platform for business stories, for marketing stories, for political economy stories. This was supposed to be China's big coming out party, right? To mark the ascendance of China as a global power. But something happened in 2008 that sort of upended that narrative a little bit, and that was the earthquake that happened in Sichuan in May, just a few months before the Olympics. And this, I'm going to run through this story. And then this is a story that happened that I reported, and some of you from the Wall Street Journal will remember this one.
The earthquake in Sichuan had far-reaching implications across China. Large numbers of Sichuanese have spread across the country to work on construction sites and in factories as migrant laborers. This group is making the 800-mile return trek under the worst circumstances. They have no information about their loved ones. This is Liu Jishu. He and his wife, Tang Shuxiu, are migrant construction workers. They were working on luxury villas in Beijing when the earthquake struck. Their first thought was for their 15-year-old daughter, Hui Mei, whom they had left behind when they searched for jobs last year. Hui Mei had died in the earthquake.
So you're probably asking, what does an earthquake or natural disaster got to do with the one-child policy? What I discovered when I followed this group of migrant workers back was this area was actually a test ground for the one-child policy before they launched it nationwide. Because prior to launching such an ambitious project, the authorities weren't sure that this could work on a nationwide basis, so they tested in certain areas, and this was one of the areas. So when this earthquake happened, not only did many people lose their children, they lost their only child. And I first started getting an inkling of this in the first few weeks after that, when I saw many of these parents going back to hospitals to reverse the sterilizations that they were forced to have as part of the one-child policy, because after you have your quota, you are required to be sterilized. This man was a migrant worker who had lost their 16-year-old daughter in the earthquake. Within 3 weeks, he had gone back to hospital to get a reverse sterilization. And he was at the time 50, and his wife was 45, so they knew that they were running out against time. But to not have a child in rural China is to not exist. They said that their village neighbors were just starting to ignore them, to shun them. They felt that they had no meaning or purpose. And the word for this, 是度, I think in Cantonese is 失獨, is actually a word that came into vogue from this period, and it means parents who have lost their only child. There are about 1 million of these parents in China. Every year, about 75,000 more join these ranks. And, aside from very real problems, they have tried to lobby the Chinese government for more compensation, because one of the problems when you lose your only child is you also lose financial security. And they've argued, of course, that they have lost out by following the rules of the policy. They have lost out, whereas the government, in many ways, has benefited by collecting all these fines. They feel that they should get a sense of these fines. And in addition to that, they also have problems getting admitted to nursing homes. Many nursing homes will not admit you if you don't have any children, because they want to know who's going to pay the bills. They also have issues, some of them buying burial plots. So this is one of the aspects of the one-child policy that sort of drew me into the story, and this is what I begin my book with. But of course, there are many other stories and many other aspects of it. So I'll skip to this one because we have a little bit of time. This man, so one of the stories I tell in the book is, how did the one-child policy come about? Who conceived it? Who are the people who came up with the idea? And some of you may be surprised to find out that the one-child policy wasn't thought of by demographers or economists, or no social scientists. This idea came up by China's missile defense team. So this man, Song Jian, is a Russian-trained missile defense scientist, and he was one of the people who came up with the idea. And the reason for that is he wasn't an initiator. No, the authorities wanted to reduce population, but they asked the scientists to come up with the numbers to justify this. And the only group of academics, intelligentsia, that were confident enough to come up with these numbers were China's defense scientists, because, don't forget, this was coming up after the Cultural Revolution. So every other kind of academic out there was very afraid to say anything that was, they had all suffered under going against the authorities. The person that I write about that is sort of the contrast to Song Jian, it's this man who was one of the few academics to actually came out on the record against the one-child policy at his inception. His name is Liang Zhongtang, and I call him China's Cassandra because a lot of his predictions about what this would mean came true, but nobody believed him at that time. He is now retired and living in Shanghai. So I write about the two of them and the ideas that they fought over. But just as an interesting sideline, this man was actually the protege of this man. Do you recognize him? He's very famous, Qian Xuesen. He was one of the founders of Caltech's JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, in the US. And he left China in disgust after the McCarthy-era communist witch hunts. And so he went to China and founded their missile program. He mentored people like Song Jian. And so I think Joseph McCarthy would probably have a sort of be sort of surprised, but probably very pleased at his third-hand role in controlling China's population and reducing the number of communists in the world today. So these are some of the stories I talk about. Another one I sort of talk about also is the idea of what this meant for the global adoption market. This is one of the most indirect global presence. The one-child policy caused many people to abandon their daughters or give them up, or in the end stop having daughters. And this resulted in over 120,000 children being adopted overseas, primarily in the US. And what happened was, at some point, what you had was a huge demand, global demand for adoptable infants, and a fast-drying supply of that. And so, of course, what resulted was issues of trafficking and baby selling. In this particular case, this man, Brian Stye, and his wife, Lon, adopted 3 daughters from China. Like many adoptive parents, they believed that they were getting genuinely unwanted children. They were doing a good deed. And what they discovered in tracing back 3 of their daughters' stories was their daughters had families back home. Some of them had families that genuinely wanted them and didn't want to give them up. And one of the things they're engaged in right now, which is very interesting, is a DNA sampling project they do. They collect DNA samples from parents in China, biological parents who've had their children stolen from them and put in a black market. And they bank the DNA at 23andMe, the Silicon Valley thing. And the idea is eventually, at some point, perhaps when the daughters are grown up, and many of them are in their 20s now, they might find something in that DNA data bank. It's a long shot. It's kind of interesting story because of that. This is another man. He was a peasant farmer. He and his teenage girlfriend, she got pregnant, so they couldn't get married because the legal age of consent in China for marriage for females is 20. They went back to his village. They had that daughter. She was not registered. When they went to work in the factories and left the daughter with the grandparents, she was seized by the family planning authorities and given up in the adoption. They believe she's now living in Chicago, but they have no way of reaching out to her. And one of the stories I talk about and I weave into the process is a personal story, and this is it. Oh wait, sorry. Well, anyway, I'll just script through that. When I was covering the earthquake and I was following around the migrant workers, I discovered that I'm pregnant myself. And this was very unexpected. But I also have a miscarriage in the process. And so this was very strange juxtaposition of writing about people who had lost their children and discovering for myself a very short-lived kind of a parenthood, so to speak. And then I would spend the next few years actually trying to get pregnant in Beijing. So I would go to IVF clinics in Beijing, and then I would discover this other side of the one-child policy, that many locals were using IVF as a way to get around the one-child policy. Because if you get twins or triplets, it counts as a single birth. You are not liable for some of the punishments. So this was kind of all these bizarre bits. Why did I put that in? And because I wanted to humanize the story. I have very many stories of very many different people in the book. And this is written for a global audience. And I remember talking to some fellow journalists, and he said, if you don't have a central character, let's face it, Western people can't keep Chinese people straight. The names are too different. They can't keep it all. You need a central character. You need a leader, a spirit leader, to hold the reader's hand through the process. So I sort of felt that by going through the whole process of thinking about what is the cost of parenthood, I would be a good spirit leader. So I weave my story into it, and I think it helps humanize the story a little bit. And I finish off with my kids, twins, that I had after that. So in the end, although this book is about the social implications of a major policy affecting the world's second largest economy, it is also essentially, in the end, a human story about what are the costs of parenthood, what are these powerful emotions that govern the reasons why we have children, and what happens when that is thwarted. And I'll finish off with just one quick little sort of plug, which is this. One of the reasons why I'm here is to launch my Chinese language book in Taiwan. And it was not easy to do that, because even though I had this book on the one-child policy and it was very topical, I could not get it published in mainland China. I had a contract, well, I didn't have a contract, I had an interest to purchase the rights, but because of the tightening censorship in China, as we know, they decided they couldn't go ahead with it. And then in Hong Kong, I could not get it published at all. And we all know in 2015 with the Causeway Bay issues. So what I actually did was I actually paid for a translation myself, and I released a free download of the book digitally so that anybody could read that. Because I felt to write a book about China that Chinese people could not read was to be defeated. So one of the surprising outshoots of that was after I did that, I actually did get an offer from a Taiwanese publisher to publish this book. So this will be the first book version, so I'm very proud of that. I'm going to Taiwan. I'm going to be doing the launch at the S-Light bookstore. Now what's interesting is I can be doing the launch in the S-Light bookstore in Taiwan, but the S-Light bookstore here is not carrying this book. So anyway, I'll leave this open to questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That's particularly interesting about the book here, and slightly disturbing. We've had previous events about the issue of academic freedom and press freedom and publishing freedoms and in Hong Kong. So that's a very interesting point. And it was really good to hear as well your remarks about the kind of human impact of all this. In your book, which I was reading yesterday, you say one of the biggest ravages committed by the communists was its assault on China's family structure. And you said just now that the point about rural China, about how to not have a child in rural China is not to exist. So you've obviously charted the extreme sort of human impacts of this policy over the years. We will open it up very shortly. I just want to start by asking you a kind of policy question, really, which is, you look at China's policy. It was first to promote having lots of children, and then to drastically cut in the one-child policy. And maybe the lesson is, and the result of that is, of course, you have wild swings in population. You have a sudden population surge, then you have a sudden population slowdown, which is going to lead to the effects that you're talking about. And maybe the lessons, and I'd be interested to know if that's the lesson that you draw, is it's better not to have a population policy at all, or at least not a coercive one, and simply to allow societies to find their own level, which does seem to happen. And I think you do describe in your book how, in fact, there were already changes afoot, so that people were having an average of 3 children instead of 6 children, simply not through coercive policies, simply through people getting richer, people urbanize, and that already leads to dramatically reduced fertility rates. So what do you think about that? I mean, is it better not to have these kind of policies and to let societies function on their own? No. Sorry,
I'm not. One of the things, when I first moved to China, it's very hard not to feel the number one thing people say, which is 人太多. You take a subway, 人太多. You go and stand in line somewhere, 人太多. It's this huge mass in population. There is a sense that resources need to be allocated. It is hard if you don't have enough resources for a significantly large population to educate and feed and give them health care. However, the problem with the one-child policy is the tendency to equate population policy with the one-child policy. That's not one and the same thing. One is a very extreme form of the of the population planning, population control. It is not necessarily the best way. Now, China actually already had a population planning policy in place, which was much less coercive. It was called the Later, Longer, and Fewer campaign. It lasted 10 years before the one-child policy, and the sharpest population reductions actually happened then, when average family size went from 6 kids to 3 kids. So yes, when you have a significantly large population and you're having to deal with very big issues on how to feed them and educate them, then yes, in a sense, a certain amount of wanting to steer growth is important. But the way it was done was, horridly, badly botched up. And clearly, you can see the path for many countries which have managed their population. The path was usually education of women, as we said, urbanization, a better educated populace, access to contraception, all those issues, not force and not extreme expectations that people are like machines, that you can dial up fertility and dial down fertility and this is the problem they have. They're switching to a two-child policy. In fact, they're going to switch very soon to one where they actively start pushing working, educated women to have more children. And it's not that easy. People are not switches like that rocket scientist guy thought it was. Go up, go down, press 1, press 2.
Singapore had a similar issue of promoting larger population and then desperately cutting it and then promoting it again, I think.
Yes, and I spent 8 years in Singapore. I remember they had that social development unit to encourage, smart people to get married, college educated. It was called the SDU, also known as Single, Desperate, and Ugly. And I'm hearing stories about how in China, in certain provinces, certain populations, they are starting to do that also.
Yeah, the SDU also had other weird things like persuading Singaporeans not to eat so much of buffets. Do you remember that?
Well, one of the things is a problem with the SDU was a certain amount of eugenics involved. They had SDU for college graduates and SDS for non-college graduates. So the whole idea was you breed with your own, which I think is very offensive to a lot of people.
It's a very Lee Kuan Yew idea, I'm afraid. Yeah, absolutely. And then you can both get a double first at Cambridge, or you can all get double first at Cambridge. Yeah. So basically, there's nothing wrong with family planning policies, but they shouldn't be coercive. I mean, the earlier Chinese policy you describe, I think, is quite similar to the policies that are adopted today by sensible family planners and people like the UNFPA. The spacing of children, education of women, those kind of things. Those are all acceptable, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, and certainly giving women access to choice. Birth control, contraception. It's very important, and now we're seeing the swing in the other direction where they're trying to prevent women from doing that. We're moving to Handmaid's Tale territory.
Right. I want to ask you whether there's a kind of feeling that the slowdown, and you do refer to this a bit in your book, that the slowdown of what will be a declining population, a large population of old people, is going to be a complete disaster for China with not enough young people, and do you think that's a little bit exaggerated, that problem? We're obviously seeing the beginnings of that in Japan at the moment with labor shortages. Or do you think that's actually not quite as serious?
I think it's going to be a huge problem. Japan, most countries, this is a first world problem, right? Most of Europe is integrating society, so China is not unique in that respect. What the one-child policy did was accelerate the process. So what took most developed countries 50 years to arrive at this point, China has arrived at it as 25 years, half the time. So they have less time to adjust or prepare, and they also have less money. You mentioned Japan. Japan's GDP per capita is, I think, a significant amount, off the top of my head. I mean, China is only like 1/9 of the per capita GDP of Korea, South Korea, for example. So you're already starting to see significant pension shortfalls. That's one issue. From the issue of public health, it's a major issue. How are you going to take care of all these old people when you have one child per family? They used to depend on the family network, on filial piety. Well, you severely cut that down. What are you going to put in its place? How much is it going to cost you?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with drastic policies is they lead to very skewed ratios. Whereas if you have policies that are introduced gently, you can gently increase your population and then stabilize it and gently decline it. But what we have at the moment is this very extreme situation where you're going to have a lot of old people and really very, very few young people of working age. Yeah. I'm inclined to open it to the floor now if we have any questions. Yes, there are lots, that's good. So let's start over there. Just please introduce yourself briefly and then ask the question.
Hello, May. Tom Holland here. Two questions, if I may. First of all, how many downloads of the Chinese translation? And secondly, very much an extension of Victor's questions, I'm curious what you think the impact of the move to a two-child policy will be, given that for much of rural China, there have been dispensations for a number of years. In effect, you've got a 1.5-child policy. And also considering that, you know, by comparison with, say, Hong Kong and Taiwan, where fertility rates are actually lower, if you look at Hong Kong, the principal form of contraception is property prices. So do you think that we'll actually see an impact in urban China, given that for many young families, property is unaffordable as it is in Hong Kong and other Chinese cities?
Hey Tom, it's great to see you again. Yeah, thanks for coming. The first question on the downloads is I don't know. And the reason is I deliberately chose not to know. When I was deciding how I was going to do this book, this Chinese language book, one of the things I was worried about was distribution. How do I get it out there, right? I remember looking at the time when Iris Chang wrote her book, The Rape of Nanjing, and she couldn't get it published in Japan because, you know, it was Japan. And she actually thought about smuggling in copies of the books, you know, to sell there. Now, of course, that was 20-something years ago. Books are digital properties now, so much more easier in a way to distribute if you don't have to charge for them. And this was the one issue that made me decide to make it free. I was worried if I tried to charge for it, that there could be a paying mechanism that could trace back to purchases of the book. One of the things that struck me was one of the Hong Kong booksellers who gave an interview after his abduction. He said one of the things that his abductors wanted was the client list. I did not want people to get in trouble for reading my book in mainland China. I did not want to risk the possibility that people would get sent to prison. So, but I also wanted them to read the book. That's why I put it out and I gave it out for free. That's my number one question. Number two, on the issue of dwindling fertility is one that's very hard to reverse. You give women choices, you give women education, the result is smaller families. And you mentioned rural families and what the impact. The impact, I think, will be most strongly felt on the one population that most benefited from the one-child policy, which is educated urban women. They were one of the beneficiaries of the original one-child policy. If you didn't have any brothers, your parents would be sending you to college. And we saw all these significant gains in terms of higher education for women and so on. But now the reverse is happening. This is the backlash. This is the population that the government wants to have more children, because if you have educated women having educated children, there's your workforce for the future. And so what we're starting to see is all these pullback of policies that used to encourage families. And it's not just coming from the government sector, it's also coming from society, from people's parents, and from the market sector. Now we're starting to see women are reporting significant issues with discrimination, because now if you're going to have 2 children, then employers are going to care about whether they have to give 2 sets of maternity leave, and then they will hire a man. These are some of the issues that we're going to see going forth.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I mean, one of the problems with population policy is the momentum effect. So it takes 30 years for a policy really to have an impact. So the one-child policy came into effect when
1980.
The Chinese population is still growing. It's going to start declining very soon, but it's still growing because you have this massive cohort of people born before the one-child policy who have children. And the same thing is happening in India, where it takes a generation basically to turn it around.
Yeah, but it doesn't take a generation to recognize some of the effects. And the problem, I think, with the government in this instance, serious oversight, is even if they came at this with the best of intentions, the signals are very clear, even as early as 10, 15 years ago, that they could have made much more significant changes and reduced it, Yeah.
Absolutely. Gentlemen at the end.
Jeff Galbraith, Orient Securities, more than what Tom Holland was asking. Since the second two-child policy came out, are there any figures about a baby boom that's occurred in the last year or so?
There's been a brief baby boomlet, so to speak. I mean, it's only been a year, right? So there has been relative and compared to before, but the actual projections are much less than what was hoped for. And this has been the case for previous, because even before this two-child policy, they had another loosening. You know, the policy where if one party in the married couple is a single child, you would be allowed to have a second child. And the take-up for that was very, very small. So this is a very significant indicator that the two-child policy were the same. One of the stories I write in my book, which I didn't talk about, the economist Liang Zhongtang, who opposed the one-child policy, actually got authorities to authorize a series of secret two-child zones across China, an experiment that affected 8 million people and took place well over 25 years. And the data from these two-child zones, where there were few restrictions, is that the birth rates in those places are below national birth rates. So, you know, even given the choices, there's not going to be a population boom.
These were not minority populations,
No,
right? These
they're
were Han
Yeah.
Chinese or whatever, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, mate. Keith Richburg from Hong Kong University. Thank you for that. I'm just wondering if you've looked at the impact of the one-child policy on the single children themselves. And I ask that being an only child. I can't imagine a whole nation of people who have no cousins or who have no, you know, so and having to support various, parents and grandparents, et cetera. How does that factor in?
That was a tricky one, right? You're writing about a whole generation, right? So, you know, it's easy to extrapolate. So, on one hand, clearly there were theories about whether this would create an entitled, spoiled generation. And I looked at a whole dearth of social data on it. It's inconclusive. A lot of it says, yes, there's difference, no, there's difference, yes, there's good difference, no, there's no good difference. The one study I found that was most indicative and different from all these studies, because most of these studies were behavioral studies that assess single children and children with siblings, and they did cross comparisons. The one study was different was by economists in Australia, where they did cohorts. So one group went after 1980, one before, and instead of doing behavioral analysis, what they did was they played games with this. So they did, games to measure your appetite for risk, games to measure your, and what they found was very significant, that the one-child population is significantly more risk-averse, more pessimistic, less generous. And of course, this is just one study, but I think there's something very significant of this. So that I think my sense, and this is a personal viewpoint, is it's less a sense of entitlement as it is the wheel is turning. The oldest of the one-child population are in their 30s. Very soon, they're going to be caring for parents who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. This is when it flips. They're no longer going to be little emperors. They're going to be little slaves. And this, it's going to be a very different narrative than the one we're seeing right now. And even as it is, the way they describe their own generation, they call themselves 屌丝, 苦逼, it's very, very pessimistic terms, Yeah.
You talk about, in the book, about one guy who has to go and look after his dad, I think, or his mother, and he becomes a sort of national hero, but he's having a pretty tough time, isn't he?
Well, the one story I wrote, there were many stories, but the one that chief narrative when I talk about the little emperor was this guy called Liu Teng, who was an improbable national hero because he took his mother to college with him. And because the authorities were seeking to sort of valorize and revive filial piety, they made him a national hero. So he got free housing in university. They made statues of him, plays of him, cartoon book of him. His mother even got a free kidney out of the whole process. And when I kept up with him over the years, and one of my theories at the back of my mind when I was talking to him was, what happens when your expectations are so limited from the start? If all you have to do is to spend time caring for your parents, does it sort of stifle your growth, your desires, your dreams? And I remember I caught up with him in 2013. I first started talking to him in 2008. And at that point, he had graduated from college, and very unusual for a lot of young, upwardly mobile Chinese. He hadn't gone anywhere. He was still living in his small town. He was still basically doing the same things he was doing, and then the spotlight had faded. No more free apartment, nothing. He was just living very quietly with his mother, and he was having trouble adjusting. And he told me he had auditioned for a reality TV show called What's Your Dream in Shanghai. It's when you go on and you sort of say, oh, my dream is to dance or sing, and then you get someone to mentor you and help you achieve your dream. So he'd gone on the show on the strength of his previous celebrity and sung a song that had been specially composed for him. And then what happened? He said, I didn't get on the show. I said, why didn't you get on the show? I said, they asked me what my dream was. I said, my dream was to live happily with my mother. And they said my dream wasn't big enough. So then I thought, oh no, this is the curse of the little emperor, blah, blah, blah. And that was in the back of my mind. But a year later, he reaches out to me and he tells me he actually has a very, very big dream. His dream was to be a woman, to have gender surgery. That's right, my little emperor was a little empress. And so I put that story in, even though it didn't confine to, when I put it in, I was like, am I confusing people? Am I talking about little emperor when it's going to be a gender issue or transgender? But the reason why I put that in the end was because I wanted to show that people can confound you, that people can surprise you, that people have an ability that can be invested. And I think this is one of the problems with the one-child policy. They did not anticipate or weigh in or factor people's ability to change and transform. People were seen less as factors of change as economic growth agents, but more as just mouths to feed. And that was a problem, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we got a question right over there, yeah.
Hi, I'm To Han Shi from MLEX. A double-barrel question. One is, are you seeing right now happening that with the one-child policy, you have all these little emperors refusing to do dirty work in factories, and they want white-collar jobs as bankers, and that might hurt China's manufacturing industry? And my second question is, how likely is it that China will have Japan's problem, where Japan is having a decreasing population? You have lots of empty Japanese homes because nobody lives in them, and property prices in Japan are dropping.
Okay, well, interesting, right? So the manufacturing issue. So prior to, when I was based in Hong Kong, I was kind of like the factory girl. One of my beats was to cover Dongguan and, the Jixiangao, the Pearl River Delta and manufacturing. And even as early as 2003, I was hearing stories from factory managers who said that they didn't have enough people to run their factories, no enough labor, starting back then. And this was the start of the fall. The era of cheap manufacturing in China is over, pretty much. Any manufacturing you're going to see going forth in China is going to be AI and robotics. China is already the biggest consumer of robots in the world, and most of this is for the running the factories. So as far as this is over, it's done, Insofar as the issue of, what was the second question again?
Empty homes, falling property prices in Japan.
I think one of the big problems with China is the big division between rural and urban. So what we're going to see, and there's never been such a big sort of age apartheid in China, right? The young people go to the cities and the old people stay in the countryside. And so what the empty homes I think we're going to see is the countryside is going to be depopulated, increasingly, yes.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rachel Carton. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation altogether. And I thought the beginning with the Sichuan earthquake was particularly interesting. And what I'd like to ask is, what part, if any, did the earthquake actually play in changing policy? Did policymakers consciously look at what had happened there and say, hey, this is a wake-up call for us? Or was it simply a sociological phenomenon?
I chose that moment because I thought it was significant, because 2008 is a period of time that many people sort of saw as a place where China could go either way. The path, of greater openness, more democracy, or the other way, which is China's own path, we will call it. And so I thought the earthquake showed what happened, because one of the problems and the great tragedies of the earthquake wasn't just that it was a natural disaster, it was what happened after. All these parents who wanted to see justice, who wanted to examine the issues of whether poorly built skull houses were done, who wanted to mourn their children, they were savagely repressed. I've met many parents who said they were forced to sign documents saying we will no longer make any protest. The narrative was the Olympics, China rising. And so they left no time for these parents to mourn, as was what was decent. And so I feel like that was what the turning point was. So the earthquake I chose was not just a natural disaster, it was a disaster of policy.
Thanks. Ben, and then the lady there, yeah. And then you have a... Yeah.
Hi, Ben Bland from the Financial Times, and also author of a new book on Hong Kong, which brings me on to my question. Why do you think you had so much trouble getting your book published? Do you think it's because of the nature of your material, which now is almost historic, given the policy has changed? Or is it just complete fear that's not grounded in reality? I think it's quite an important distinction between whether this is sort of real directed censorship or it's just fear and self-censorship.
I'd love to say I was so important to the CCP size that I'm in some sort of vendetta, but that's not the case. I think I'm a small fish caught up in a much bigger issue, which is that of tightening grip, not just in China, but Greater China. I mean, it was also an issue of timing. I was trying to get a Chinese edition out right about the time when this adoption happened, which sent a huge chill through this Hong Kong publishing industry. So maybe if my book had come out a little bit before, a little bit after, you know, things in China, it's always a question of testing your time. Sometimes you're lucky, and sometimes the hammer swings down upon you, and you almost can never control that. So I think that's what it was for me. Yeah.
How about Singapore?
Singapore doesn't care.
You would do it in English in Singapore, or they
I would, no, I mean, no, my book would be available in Singapore. I don't think the Singaporeans particularly have a dog in this fight. And of course, they actually do have a dog in the fight with China now in the South China Seas issue. So I don't think it's in. I do quote Lee Kuan Yew a little bit in there because one of the things he actually said, which I think is very indicative of what China wants, is he said he was sorry that he gave women in Singapore equal opportunities, because this has led to an issue with them trying to grow the population, educated women not having so many babies. He actually says he regrets it, and I suspect there's a little bit of that thinking in China.
Yeah, okay. Yes, lady.
Hi, May. Lindsay Robertson. I'm a TV producer. I remember hearing stories about families that only had boys that would abduct young girls to keep them in the family so the boy would then have someone to marry. Is that, how much of that is an urban myth? Is it something that you came across a lot during your research? And were these events that are taken very seriously by authorities and, you know, properly investigated?
One of the things I do talk about is the bachelor villages, and I write about that, how I go and visit this bachelor village where they had a whole series of runaway brides, because one of the issues is bride prices in rural China have shot up as a result of the shortage. And so I was very, very attracted to this village in central China where all these women ran a scam and they got married to these guys and they took the money and they dashed off. So I thought it was kind of really interesting. But I found it very sad because I actually talked to one of the bachelors, the bridegrooms who had been jilted, and he was really heartbroken. I mean, he is going to be living in a reality that's not of his own making. You know, his parents had borrowed all this money to help him to get married, and now he has no wife. They're all in debt. They don't have a very big future. But in answer to your question, sex trafficking is on the rise. And most of these are border countries, North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam. A lot of women are being trafficked into China to meet this demand. And as far as the authorities are concerned, I don't think there's a significant amount of interest, not on China's part. When they find these women, most of the cases, the answer is to deport them. So North Korea, if you deport the woman back to North Korea, then chances are that she might be put to death or be put in a prison camp. That's not very nice for her. It's not her fault she was trafficked, but what can she do? $1,500, I think, is the going rate now for a woman from North Korea as a bride in China. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? I think we can probably... Now, am I right in thinking that your books are on sale outside?
Yeah, some... Oh, they
sold out. Oh, sorry. Okay, but you can get it on Amazon, I guess, or order it from a bookstore.
Well, I suppose Swindon's is stocking the book, so go Swindon's. And I also let some flyers out there for the Chinese language book and where you can buy it. I think you can buy it at Joint Press. Yeah, so I would encourage those of you who are Chinese speaking or Chinese speaking friends to spread the word, because clearly it's not easy to sell this book in Chinese at all. And I would like to help my Taiwanese publishers who have basically taken a big risk to try and push this book forward. Yeah.
With that, I would like to thank Mei Fong for a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming, and enjoy your coffee, tea, wine if you still have any left. Thank you.